Welcome to Foreword, a podcast series dedicated to coverage of sustainable and responsible investment issues across the globe and brought to you by ISS ESG, the responsible investment arm of Institutional Shareholder Services. In each episode, we'll examine emerging issues and explore the latest trends and developments that are shaping the ESG landscape. I'm Mara Souders, Communications Lead for ISS ESG, and I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleagues Yovanka Bylander, Head of North American Client Success, and Hernando Cortina, Head of Index Strategy, who will discuss the new provisional EU Climate Benchmark Series, a recently announced partnership between ISS ESG and German index provider Solactive.
My name is Yovanka Bylander, and I am thrilled to be here today with my colleague, Hernando Cortina. I've had the pleasure of working with Hernando in the past and know that this is really his main strength. And so I'm really happy to be working with him again, reunited and working with him again. How are you, Hernando?
Thank you so much, Yovanka. I'm equally excited and delighted to be working on really interesting topics that matter a lot to our investors and I think to a lot of us personally as well.
Terrific. So listen, today we're going to be talking about Solactive and ISS ESG's provisional EU Climate Benchmark Series. And I think to kick it off, Hernando, it'd be really interesting for you to tell us a little bit about how your background as an investment strategist and trader kind of informs the ISS ESG approach to indices in general and this series in particular.
Yes, you're right. The first part of my career working on index strategy, looking at global and emerging markets. And that's really helpful because I've been looking at indices for a long time. I understand how people use them. I understand how important and influential they are. And I understand that as the world is moving to a climate and an ESG-focused world, benchmarks is extremely important. I'm excited to be able to apply the new tools that we have at ISS and the data that we have to really help shift capital in the direction of greener and more robust data.
Terrific. So now tell us, a little bit more about this series. And I'm, especially interested in learning more about what makes this series of indices different from what else is out there, right? It feels like every day we're seeing a headline about somebody launching a new index. What makes these different?
Maybe before jumping into that, I'm going to just give a quick background what's happening in the climate right now, just because I think we're all aware of the news and we see what's happening in the headlines, but just a couple of data points to kind of set the stage I think would be helpful. NASA just reported a couple of weeks ago that 2019 was the second warmest year since modern records began in the 1880s. So the world has already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius above the 1950 to 1980 average. So we're already at 1 degree world right now. If you look at the decade that just ended in 2019, it's also by far the warmest on record. So when you look at the 2009s, the 2019s, and you average the temperature by decade, it really looks like a staircase going up. So it's not a fluke. It's not just 1 year. It's the whole decade's been really, really warm. And just a couple of tidbits, because people hear 1 degree, it doesn't sound like that much, but it is very meaningful. Parts of the world are warming much faster. So Antarctic temperatures are already 3 times warmer than they were in that same period, so up about 3 degrees. Bringing it to the state level, Alaska had its warmest year on record going back 100 years. So the point is climate change is real. And I think companies and investors can have an effect on trying to control that through their investments in equity and fixed income markets. And that's where these benchmarks come in.
Those are some really startling statistics there, Hernando.
Yeah, so I think, Yovanka, if you look at the Paris Agreement that aims to keep global temperatures from heating up beyond where we are right now with a target of keeping it as close as possible to 1.5 degrees, and in any case, no higher than 2 degrees, where damage will be really serious if it goes beyond that in terms of, impact on industry, on agriculture, on humanity, of course. What the Paris Agreement tells us when you boil it down and you look at the updates from the UN is that carbon emissions need to go down by about 7.5% a year between 2020 and the year 2030. So that's what we need to do as a planet to keep global warming in those ranges. And that's where these benchmarks come in as well.
So how did our approach to building these indices, how does it differ from maybe what others are doing in the space?
So I think the strength of these indices is that they're really set on the standards that were defined by the technical expert group of the European Union, which really got together and decided to standardize what is a climate benchmark, what should it look like, what requirements should it meet. And as you know, one of the challenges in ESG is that there are very few standards. We like standards because they set the stage. It reduces the amount of uncertainty, and we know exactly what we need to do, what data needs to be delivered. So the EUTG group set basically two kinds of standards for benchmarks, what they call climate transition benchmarks and what they call Paris-aligned benchmarks. Those are two families of benchmarks. The CTB benchmarks meant to assist in implementing kind of climate-aware core equity allocations. So they're really there to replace your basic indices that serve as a basic market cap benchmark in a climate-aware way. Whereas the PAB, the Paris-aligned benchmarks, are really very ambitious benchmarks for really being aligned with the Paris Agreement and being fully prepared for a decarbonized future. Those are the standards and the families that are defined. If we look at what are the requirements for those benchmarks, there are quite a few, but I will just highlight two that are important. One is an immediate decline in carbon intensity in the indices, be it 30% for the CTBs and 50% plus for the PABs. And most importantly, this is where it gets interesting because these benchmarks are kind of dynamic. These indices need to decline their carbon intensity by at least 7% a year going forward. And that's where the Paris Agreement comes in, and that's where the data I referred to earlier comes in. These benchmarks are really set to have a portfolio that will be consistent with the Paris Agreement, especially the PAB, going out to the middle of the century and beyond that. So that's the difference of these benchmarks. They're really forward-looking, standardized climate benchmarks, which we haven't seen before in the marketplace.
Well, what about the data that's powering them?
Yes. Well, I think the benefit or the solution that ISS is providing is really leveraging the breadth of our capabilities across our data sets. And the requirements that we do fulfill for all these benchmarks, they include not only the reduction in emissions, and we're happy to provide scope 1 plus 2 plus 3 emissions from day one, which I think is a requirement that only needs to be phased in over 4 years for the benchmarks. The benefit of having that on day one is that we're able to control the turnover and realignment of the indices over time, so it'll be a little bit more stable for our investors. In addition, we use our set of norms-based research and energy and extractives data that power a whole bunch of our products, but that we use them to great effect in these benchmarks to be able to eliminate controversial weapons, societal norms violators, and companies with high exposures to, say, coal, oil, and natural gas. Those are some examples of the data we use. As I mentioned, we partner with Solactive, so we work with them to make sure that all requirements are met and that the rebalancing going forward will fulfill the technical expert group requirements.
So once we put that all together, what do the results look like?
So we're very happy about how the benchmarks turn out. One tool that we can use to assess the impact of these benchmarks is the climate impact report that our climate team produces. And this is a very unique product where investors can enter their portfolios down to equity and bond level ISINs, their weights, and the portfolio analysis will give us a lot of information, including the degree of alignment with the 2-degree goals of the portfolio going out to 2050. So it's a way to really, quote unquote, verify that the intent of the technical expert group is actually being realized in practice with these benchmarks. We launched a couple of families last week, one covering developed global markets and one covering European markets. So we have 2 regions and 2 benchmarks for each of those regions. When we look at the PABs, for example, we see some really interesting statistics, such as, a 99% reduction in fossil fuel reserves. We see 65% green power shares within the utilities part of those indices. And I think what I really like is to see that in our climate scenario, they're both 2-degree aligned through the year 2050. And so investors can look at that projected emissions of the portfolio going out to 2050 and realize that whether they fit within the carbon budget that's needed to meet 2-degree goals.
And Hernando, again, you having been an investment strategist before, what's going to be the best way for investors to use these indices?
It's a great question. And we've had some really nice feedback since we launched the past week with a number of investor queries. We really see a whole bunch of applications. It could be ETFs. It could be separately managed accounts. Depending on investor needs, they can be used as is, or they can modify them further with their own additional criteria. So one benefit is that, we have this family of benchmarks out there, but we're able to customize them to meet any specific client need around the world. I would add, even though that these benchmark standards are coming from the European Union, we certainly don't see them as a product that will only appeal to investors in the EU. We think that the fact that it has these strong standards that are really, defining what climate benchmarking means that it could find use in Asia, in the United States, and other places, just because of the comparability that the standards bring across regions.
Yes, and I know from my conversations with investors too, the EU guidelines are sort of drawing the line in the sand, and they are providing a standard that's a great basis for conversation. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Hernando. I think just to close out, if anyone is interested in learning more about our index series, please email sales@iss-esg.com. Thanks so much, Hernando.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Yovanka and Hernando, thank you very much for your insights into the EU Climate Benchmark series. For more details on this episode's topic, be sure to download both our podcast as well as the corresponding press release from our website at issgovernance.com/ESG. For questions, feel free to reach out to our experts via email at podcast@iss-esg.com. That's it for now, and thanks for tuning in.